Chapter 9, Lesson 3, Life in the Tropical North. You can find us on page 286 in your textbook or in your online textbook right here. Let's jump into our lesson today. Our objectives are to identify where people in the tropical north live, to identify languages spoken in the tropical north, to describe various religions, daily life, and the arts in the tropical north, and to examine the ongoing issues and struggles in the countries in the tropical north. We're going to begin by watching an introductory video that gets you a snapshot into what life is like in this specific portion. If you saw that, it said Panama hats, but you know that in the tropical north we're not talking about Panama because Panama was actually in the Central American region that we were learning about. Why are we talking about Panama hats when we're talking about the northern countries in South America? Let's take a look.
It may be confusing, but Panama hats do not come from Panama. Any more than guinea pigs come from Guinea. They come from here, central Ecuador. They simply got misnamed when Teddy Roosevelt was seen sporting them down at the Panama Canal. This is the small coastal town of Montecristi, one of the last great centers of Panama hat production. It's here that I met up with American Brent Black, a leading purveyor of Panamas. Where do you stay?
Not there. Those are not from Montecristi.
He's my personal shopper for the day, trying to find just the right Panama for me and my head.
This is a pretty decent hat.
These hats are nice enough, but this is the kind of hat Brent sells. Elegant and impossibly light with a weave so fine, they're like linen to touch. Now you might ask yourself, why do these hats cost so much? Well, consider the source.
Buenos dias, Simon.
Brent led me to the dusty mountain town of Pile, home of one of the finest weavers in the world.
Simon Espinal, Felipe.
As generations before him, Simone spends hours a day stooped over a bench, nimbly turning straw into gold.
How long has it taken to get to that point there?
¿Cuántas semanas? 2 meses. It spent 2 months to get that far.
2 months of work.
Yes.
It's like silk.
Yes.
But Simone is of a dying breed. Once there were hundreds of such master weavers. Now there's only a handful.
How many of these do you need to actually make a hat?
The creation of a hat begins 5 miles into the jungle. A search for cogoyas, young shoots of a specific variety of palm. Simone needs hundreds.
300.
300 of these to make one hat. There's a nice crowd here this morning.
Brent left a lucrative advertising career to help preserve a fading industry. He formed the Montecristi Foundation, which helps support weavers, promotes them as artists, and brings medical care to the whole town.
Gracias por venir.
We could barely conduct the interview for all the people thanking him.
Gracias. Gracias por venir.
Make no mistake, Brent is a businessman, making good money, selling very high-end hats. He's intentionally forcing up the base pay for weavers to improve their lives and hopefully attract more young people to the craft.
And that's the idea, is to keep going back and forth and keep raising as the market will bear it till we get to the point where they make a really good wage, I hope.
One encouraging sign, Simone's children are already learning to weave, new hands, mastering an ancient craft.
They are the future. There will be another generation because of Simone and because of his children.
As you can see, life's a little bit different compared to what you and I might be accustomed to. Let's get into our reading for today. People and places. Our guiding question says, what ethnic groups populate the tropical north and where do they live? You're welcome to follow along on your online textbook or click the play to listen or continue with Mr. Shane. People and places. People of European, African, Native, and mixed descent are the major population groups of the countries that border the Pacific and Caribbean coasts. African, South Asian, and ethnically mixed peoples form the majority in Atlantic coast countries. Population groups. Ecuador has the tropical north's greatest indigenous population. About 1 in 4 Ecuadorians is Native American. If mestizos, or people of white and Native American descent, are added, the ratio becomes 9 out of every 10 Ecuadorians. Venezuela and Colombia have the opposite distribution. Some 20% of their populations are white and 1 or 2% are Native American. Colombia's native population is the lowest of any Andean country. Mestizos are the largest group, accounting for more than 2/3 of Colombians and Venezuelans. The African population of Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia are still small, although some 15% of Colombians have mixed African and European ancestry. The descendants of contract laborers from India are Suriname's largest group, making up nearly 40% of the population. An equal number are people of African and mixed African descent. A large Indonesian population is also present. Whites and Native Americans total less than 5% of Suriname's population. Neighboring Guyana is home to more Native Americans. This group makes up 10% of the country's population. Ethnic Africans make up 1/3 of the population, and East Indians account for more than 40%. The country has no significant white population. About 1 in 6 Guyanese is of mixed ancestry. People of mixed descent make up most of the French Guiana's population. Small groups of French, Native Americans, Chinese, East Indians, Laotians, Vietnamese, Lebanese, Haitians, and Africans also live in French Guiana. Where people live. Guyana's population remains largely rural. Elsewhere in the tropical north, most people live in cities. Bogota, Colombia's capital on high Andes Plateau, is home to almost 5 million people. It is the North's largest city and the 5th largest in South America. Colombia's Caribbean lowlands are home to about 20% of its people, mainly in Cartagena and other port cities along the coast. The country's Pacific coast is sparsely settled. Most of the people there are descendants of enslaved Africans who worked on plantations near the Caribbean Sea. As they were freed or they escaped, they migrated into remote areas in western Colombia. The Llanos, where cattle ranching is the main activity, is another area with very few people. Quito, Ecuador, is another mountain city with nearly 2 million people. Most of Ecuador's Native Americans live in or around Quito, where they farm rural mountain valleys nearby. Most other Ecuadorians live along the coast of Guayaquil. The country's largest city and major port is located there. Most Venezuelans live along the coast. As in Colombia and Ecuador, Venezuelans began migrating to cities in the mid-1900s for the jobs and opportunities they offered. Today, more than 90% of the country's people live in Caracas, the capital city of 3 million, and other cities on or near the coast. The countries of Guyana, Suriname, and the territory of French Guiana are sparsely populated. The population of the three combined total only half the population of Caracas. The interior of French Guiana has few roads and is largely uninhabited. In Suriname, small groups of Native Americans live in Guiana highlands. Nearly everyone else lives along the coast. Suriname's capital, Paramaribo, a city of 2,600, is home to more than half the country's population. Most Guyanese also live on the coast, mainly in small farm towns. Each town's farmland extends inland for several miles. The country's interior is home to a few groups of Native Americans and scattered mining and ranching settlements. Here's a picture of where people live. You can see that the darker the color shows the higher level of population. Down here and on this, what would be western coast, you have a lot of the mountain areas, so they describe these as being mountainous cities because you're connected to the northern portion of the Andes. And here you have a larger population because you're connected to the Caribbean. As you go further to the east here, however, here's where you have less and less population in some of these smaller settlements and or now countries. People and cultures. Despite its largely Spanish heritage, no other culture unifies the tropical north. Instead, its culture can be defined by the wide variety of ethnic groups that populate the region. Language groups. Spanish is the official language of Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela. There are differences in Ecuadorian Spanish because of the influence of Native American language in each region of the country. More than 10 native languages are spoken in Ecuador, more than 25 native languages are spoken in Venezuela, and some 180 in Colombia. Colombians, however, have taken great care to preserve the purity of the Spanish language. Languages in Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana reflect their colonial heritage as well as their ethnic populations. Creole, a group of languages that enslaved people from various parts of Africa developed to communicate on colonial plantations, is widely spoken. Most people in Guyana speak English. In Suriname, the official language, Dutch, is spoken only as a second language. Native American languages, Hindi, and other South Asian languages are heard in both countries. Religion and daily life and the arts. Before we read that, let's just take a quick look at the language groups. So people in the tropical north, they speak a variety of languages. There isn't a unifying culture or heritage throughout this area because there were competing countries that colonized and obviously all of the different native groups that were here before those colonizations. The official languages of European origin come from that colonization. So if a country speaks a specific language, it's probably because of the people that came to settle there. But there still is a strong presence of those native languages, as you saw in Colombia with over 180. Another strong language is the Creole language, which uses a mix of words from the African and European languages, were spoken in some regions. These languages develop as a result of communication on colonial plantations. So imagine on a plantation, the slaveholders speak their language, and the slaves have to come up with a way to communicate without letting the slave owners know what they're talking about if they're planning anything, or even if they just wanted to simply communicate with each other. So you have this language that develops, and now its tradition has been passed down and has continued to be a means of communication here. Hundreds of native languages are spoken in this region, which is pretty unique to compare to other parts of the world. The religion. Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela are overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, again attributed to the settling nation of Spain. No more than 10% of the people in these countries practice other religions. The religions practiced in Guyana, French Guiana, and Suriname reflect the variety of ethnic groups that live there. Suriname's population is made up of about equal numbers of Roman Catholics, Protestants, Hindus, and Muslims. Guyana's population is largely Protestant and Hindu, with sizable Catholic and Muslim minorities. In all other countries, some Native Americans practice indigenous religions. Here's an example. Venezuela, 96% Roman Catholic. Colombia, 90%. Roman Catholic in Ecuador, 95%. Suriname, as it mentioned, has a wide variety, and they're all about relatively the same in terms of their percentage. French Guiana, a large portion is considered Christian, so there's a mix of Roman Catholic and Protestant, with some of the other different belief systems mixed in as well. And Guyana, again, having maybe a larger percentage in terms of Hindu, and it looks like Protestant in comparison to what would be normally in this region, the large Roman Catholic presence. Each country's food, music, and other cultural elements reflect its ethnic and religious makeup. Venezuela and Colombia and Ecuador celebrate Carnival, though the festivities are not as colorful or as lively as those in Brazil. Regional religious festivals are celebrated in many of the Andes communities. Culture often differs by geographic area. Native Americans in mountain regions weave baskets and cloth using designs that are hundreds of years old. They play Andean music using drums and flutes and other traditional instruments. Along the coast of Colombia and Venezuela, a dance called the Cumbaya blends the region's Spanish and African heritages. Other Venezuelan coastal music and dance, such as the salsa and merengue, show Caribbean island influences as well. Maracas and guitars are used to perform the music of the lalano. Ongoing issues. Many people who live in the tropical north are poor, although natural resources in the region are plentiful. For generations, those resources have mostly benefited only a wealthy few. This situation has created tensions within and between countries. Trade relations. Many South American leaders believe the only way to strengthen their country's economies is to expand trade. In 2008, the countries in the tropical north joined the rest of South America to form the Union of South American Nations, known as UNASUR. One of the organization's goals is to end tariffs, or taxes on imported goods, on trade between member nations. Another goal is adopting a uniform currency similar to the euro. So if they have no tariffs, that means the goods in one country cost the same as they do in another country, which would promote that trade. If there's taxes and tariffs on these things, a lot of times then those goods that are coming from a different country become more expensive, and then they're less likely to be traded or passed or bought because of the different price variances between those things. So if you open up free trade, a lot of times it's thought to benefit those countries, although there's a constant competition between the countries to obviously provide for themselves in and amongst all of the other countries as well. A northern neighbor. Another challenge is improving the region's relationship with the United States. The relationship has sometimes been rocky in the past, as when the United States helped Panama gain independence from Colombia in the early 1900s. Relations between the United States and Colombia have improved greatly. The United States and the Colombian government are working together to stop the flow of illegal drugs. Challenges in Venezuela. In 1998, Venezuela elected Hugo Chavez, a former military leader, as president. Chavez frequently criticized the United States and became friendly with the anti-U.S. governments in Cuba and Iran. After his election, Chavez promised to use Venezuela's oil income to improve conditions for the country's poor. Among other actions that angered U.S. leaders in 2009, he seized control of U.S. companies that were developing oil resources in Venezuela. His strong rule split Venezuela into opposing groups. Working-class people supported Chavez, but middle-class and wealthy Venezuelans opposed his policies. Struggles in Colombia and Ecuador. Colombia has undergone a long and bitter struggle between the country's government and Colombian organization called the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC. One of FARC's goals is to curtail the role of foreign governments and businesses in Colombia's affairs. Another goal is to provide help and support for nation's poor farmers. FARC is funded through various means, including the production and sale of illegal drugs. In Ecuador, indigenous people protest for rights and blamed President Rafael Correa for not keeping his promises. Correa had promised to rewrite Ecuador's constitution. Among other things, he pledged to extend the rights of the people. Disappointed when Correa did not act, indigenous peoples organized to win rights for access to land, basic services, and political representation. Those are the ongoing issues in the country. Here's Hugo Chavez and Correa as an example, just to see what those men look like. And we take a look at us completing our objectives as you're looking to go back and reread to make sure that you've got your quiz taken care of for this lesson. We identified where people in the tropical north live by looking at that map and seeing the description of where those population distributions are. We identified the languages spoken in the tropical north and the variety of those native languages and the influence of the colonialization to why the people speak what they speak, where they live. We also described various religions, the daily life and arts in the tropical north, and examined those ongoing issues. God's blessings. Hope this helps you complete that quiz.